Good afternoon and welcome to Off the Cuffs. This is Bobby Kimbrough. Glad to have with Mr. Paul James from the Public Defender's Office today. Very excited to have you here, and I appreciate you coming across the street to talk with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Happy to do so.
Yeah. So while I know you, a lot of folk don't know who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you come to be in the Public Defender's Office and head that office? Where are you from originally?
Well, I was raised here since about 1969. So
wow.
I'm one of those northern transplants, but I came down when I was about 9. And I've lived in Winston-Salem except when I went to school. And I went to school undergraduate at Duke and Carolina for law school and down in Chapel Hill. And then practiced for about a year in Raleigh and then moved back to Winston and practiced with several firms here. Had my own firm for about 10 years with a partner. And then since the majority of what I like to do is criminal practice, when we opened the public defender's office here in 2003, Pete Clary, who was appointed public defender then, hired me. It took him a couple tries because he had to raise it up a bit since I had a lot of experience. And I was like, that'd be fun, but I'm not sure I'm ready yet. But then when I did join, I was there in 2003 and been there as an assistant public defender till the end of 2014 when I was appointed as the chief public defender when Mr. Clary was retired on that position. And then I've been chief public defender since 2015. So,
what does that mean? Like a lot of people don't know. What is the chief public defender? What does that do? What do you
under
do?
the statutes enacted by the legislature, the chief public defender is essentially the same as the chief DA or the elected district attorney. I'm not elected. I'm appointed in a process for that. But our offices are equivalent in the structure and setting from the general statutes. We are in the same retirement pool. We're in the same pay range. We're sort of between the Superior Court judges and the District Court judges. And we are held in the same process. In other words, to remove someone like a district attorney or a public defender requires a judicial process to show some problem there. The job is appointed every 4 years by the senior resident Superior Court judge from the list of candidates that the bar has approved, and then that person makes that determination as to who should continue with that job or not, as they see fit.
Wow.
But during that period, otherwise, the office is sort
of
independent.
So who do you all represent?
Oh, about 85% of the defendants in this county. So
how do I, so if I go to court, and as they say, the attorney will be appointed for you if you cannot afford one. That's where you all come into play?
Yeah, that's actually not quite correct anymore because the legislature has sort of eliminated from consideration, depending on your record level, the triggering element of whether or not you can be appointed counsel. There are two things. Number one, whether you are determined by the court to be indigent and unable to afford to hire your own attorney. And number two, even if you are indigent, do you have enough of a criminal record that you could be exposed, or the charge itself expose you to a potential active sentence? If you can't get either a jail sentence or a revocation of probation to an active sentence for anything like a class 3 misdemeanor, for example, you don't have the required criminal history on a second-degree trespassing, even though you're entitled to be represented by counsel, you would have to either hire your own or represent yourself because we would not be allowed to represent you because you don't have enough criminal history to get a potential active sentence. So for anything that is relatively minor with someone who has no real criminal history, they're not actually going to be able to get court-appointed counsel for those cases. They can hire their own. They should also be, if they represent themselves, they should probably just plead not guilty and make the state go to the process of proving it because they're not going to get any worse than if they just plead guilty, even if they were found guilty at that level. So there's no real, but unfortunately the legislature and the U.S. Supreme Court have allowed that low on a level to go without representation. And that has unfortunate consequences because if you get a criminal conviction for, say, second-degree trespassing or something, it still shows up on your criminal history record. So, and that could be bad for an employer or something else. And had you had appropriate counsel at the time, you might not have been convicted. So really, it is unequal in that point.
So you say, I've always heard that people say appropriate counsel, all counsel is not equal. How many lawyers do you have?
Counting myself, we have 19.
Wow.
So, and I carry a caseload as well. So
you carry a caseload?
Oh yeah, I have 9 first-degree murder cases on my docket at the moment.
Wow.
But
Do you think all counsel is equal?
no, just like all DAs are not equal, all sheriffs are not equal.
Right.
Some are better trained than others. Some are
Right.
more intuitive than others. There's a certain minimum standard that any lawyer has to meet to pass the bar and to maintain practice, just like any district attorney has to do. And then sometimes it just depends on the day of the week. You get someone has a bad day at home and they come in and they're not terribly on ball with what they're doing, whether it's a DA, a sheriff, a police officer, or a public defender. But for the most part, the private bar in this county is quite well trained. There are shining examples and there are some less shining examples, but the majority of our public defenders and private bar are very well trained and know what they're doing, and for the level they're assigned, because we do assign people to different levels of criminal charges. Serious felonies go to a certain number of the attorneys in my office. Less serious felonies go to the lesser experienced ones, and then the people who are handling district court criminal matters on a misdemeanor basis probably have the least experience, but that's where they're getting the training and the supervision from the senior staff.
Let me ask you a question. I've asked a lot of lawyers this. I know quite a few lawyers, and I've always asked them this question. How do you represent somebody and you know that they're guilty?
Professionally.
I like that. Professionally.
I'll give you an example. There was a grossly aggravated murder case. I think the victim's name, unfortunately, is Polly Klaas in California. And they were on trial for a death penalty case.
Yeah.
And some idiot national commentator put out the California State Bar number and told his audience to call and complain because the lawyers representing the defendant knew he had done it because they were in negotiations with the state as to take the death penalty off the table if he told them where the body was. But the trial itself did not have that information in it. And the lawyers in closing had argued that, these are different possibilities of who could have done it. And the national commentator got all upset and that was unethical. It absolutely was not. It was actually their absolute duty to do that. And what they were doing was characterizing the evidence that was before the court. They never put their client on to say he didn't do it because they couldn't, because they knew he had. But they can characterize what the state's evidence was to try to cast doubt on it in other forms using the evidence that's already there, which is the only thing you can comment on in a trial, evidence that has come into the tribunal. And so the poor California State Bar was flooded with calls from all over the country complaining about it, but that action on behalf of those lawyers was exactly what they were supposed to do. Now, they would have been ethically prohibited from putting their client on the stand and letting him lie. That would be absolutely forbidden.
Right.
But they certainly never had intended to put him on the stand. And less than until he had said something that was just grossly false on a witness stand, they would be able to characterize the other witness that the state put on and try to cast doubt on them or offer alternate theories, and that's their job. They certainly probably didn't condone the actions of their client, and we would not condone the actions of any of our clients that committed a crime, but not all people who were charged have actually committed a crime.
That's true. But how do you juggle that? I was sitting here thinking about a case where if I know the person did it, right? And they basically has told me, because I guess the conversation between you and that person is confidential.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And they've told you that they did it. And basically you trying to minimize, I guess, their exposures to time or whatever. Well,
I'll give you a worst case scenario from a standpoint of people's question about ethics. We have the Fourth Amendment search and seizure rules where law enforcement cannot search without probable cause and a search warrant if it's at the home, and car is a different exception because it's mobile, so that you need the same level of probable cause, but you're not required to get a search warrant.
Right.
But let's say you pull someone over on a traffic stop and you have a hunch there may be something wrong, but you don't have probable cause to search that car. But you open that trunk and you find a dead body there with a knife in it, and then on that, the knife is a full confession from the person who did it attached saying, I am the worst person on the planet. I have just murdered this person for fun. That case is probably going to get thrown out of court, and the defense lawyer is going to make a suppression motion to say you can't use any of that evidence because you illegally searched that car. That's a horrible factor for the victim's family because they're never going to get justice because that person is going to walk scot-free because of the mistake of law enforcement there, which may have been a good faith mistake, but it's the Fourth Amendment is a prophylactic clause. It's not meant to benefit the defendants. It's meant to restrain the police from going beyond their authority. And we do not want to live in a police state. I don't think policemen want to live in a police state. So that is the constraining level that the Fourth Amendment and Fifth Amendment and other limiting factors come into play in what police can do. Had that officer had probable cause to search that car, he would be fully entitled to use everything he found, including the note and the knife and everything else.
If he had probable cause.
But if he did not, and the defense lawyer was doing his job, he would have filed a motion to suppress. And if the judge was doing his job, he would have had to throw it out, even though he would be going, this man is guilty. But
so let me switch gears. So there's a lot of things going on about policing in America now, right? You've been a defense attorney for years, right? For a long time.
35 years at this point, I think.
35 years, wow.
Maybe 36.
Yeah. There's only 3 people in this room that old, right? Everybody else is babies, right?
You're old, yes.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. So my question is this, right? How do you feel about a lot of the rhetoric that you hear now about defund the police?
Well, that's the stupidest phrase I've ever heard, frankly. Yeah. And it's a bad choice even for those who are propounding the idea. What they're actually talking about is not defunding the police, but diverting some funding to other non-uniform, non-armed intervention, like mental health workers or others to go out and diffuse situations rather than having someone who has to escalate to violence or deadly force as a first or even middle resort. But the phrase defund the police is just rock dumb. I mean, it's just we need police. We need police who are well-trained and well-funded, and they need to have the resources to do their job. And it's a tough job. I do not want to do it. But they also are being asked to do too much that really isn't in their wheelhouse. They need to be, for example, if we had mental health intervention counselors on hand to go to potential suicide situations or things where they could start out and see if they could de-escalate with the police, the armed police on call or in the background where they didn't have to come in and confront or escalate the situation, you would probably have fewer deadly conflicts or, shootings that come out of it. And working cooperatively, they would be able to do that. So that would cause... And I don't know that you need to divert funds from, I think the police are already underfunded in a fair amount of areas. The legislatures simply need to put more funding into that sort of community patrols, policing, interventions, and that would require funding other sources, but not defunding the police. I think what most people get really upset about these days is using funding given by the government, whether it's federal or state, to police departments to basically arm with warlike vehicles or warlike equipment, which unless you're going to war, you really don't need.
I'll give you that one. But, when people say that, I always ask, what do you mean by defund the police, right? And I never really get a concrete answer. And then my next question is and maybe you can explain this to me, is that when people talk about having a mental health worker or a social worker to respond to a call, I don't understand how that model will work.
Well, I think there's a couple of states that actually have put that into place right now. I think Colorado is one of them, and maybe California as a jurisdiction. I'm not sure. It's somewhere in the West.
I got to research that because, like, when a call comes into the communication center, right? Like, for example, a welfare check comes in. Who would you send on a call like that?
On a welfare check, for example, you might have a patrol car in the area ready to back up, but you could send non-uniform, or they could be uniformed, but unarmed city personnel to say, hey, we're out here to check, because they're non-threatening.
Right.
And there's a shocking statistic that I saw the other day. We're the most heavily armed country in the world.
Without
Even
question.
Yemen is behind us we have, and now the number I saw was it blew my mind. We have, for every 100 people in this country, we have 120 guns.
Oh yeah, I see the request for gun permits every day.
And Yemen is the next highest country in the world, and they're in a civil war, and they have 55 per 100. Right. So, but in comparison, for example, to Great Britain in the last 10 years has had 22 deaths by officer shooting. We've had probably 5,000.
Without question.
Some huge number. And I'm not accurate on what the numbers are, but it's a huge number in comparison to, and to civilized nations. But most of that comes from the fact that most of their police are unarmed. In fact, British police, when they come into some place, if they're armed, they shout "armed police," so that
That's true.
people know that they're coming. Whereas everybody in this country assumes any police officer is armed. But that's the sort of intervention. And there's not all situations where they could do that. And it may require that someone come along with an officer, but the officer isn't the primary contact point and could stay in the background unless they were really needed. Whereas when police come in, particularly in certain communities, there's an automatic distrust of that individual coming in. Is like, what's going to happen when he's here?
Right. The reason I asked that, when they talk about that model of a social worker or a mental health professional responding to a call, I think that's a very dangerous situation because you have no idea what you're responding to. Same in case in point, Watauga County, they was responding to a welfare check when actually it was something totally different. Now, it might work if you say you're going to partner a social worker with a patrol officer from the beginning. That model might get a little traction because you got something there.
You've got to have backup.
You got to have it right there.
Right. You can't say, 15 minutes later they'll be here.
So. Yeah, that won't work. They'd have to be there simultaneously, right there together.
But I think the priority is they have to be in the background. They have to be maybe not even seen, but available as needed. And if the other party is wearing a walkie-talkie or in some sort of communication service device, then they can stay in that communication and assess the situation. And
how much you think it would cost to fund something like that?
Well, I don't think social workers are paid that much, quite frankly.
No. I'm saying, do you think we would have enough to say, okay, we're going to pull from the social workers we got?
No, we'd have to increase the number. They're already overworked as they are.
Exactly. So we'd have to increase the budget, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the part about defunding the police.
That's where I was going with it.
It's not a defunding. It's a refunding. Let's put more money into these particular programs and resources where we know we need to address it. We still have to have patrol officers. We still have to have people dealing with violent situations. Exactly. We got to have the equipment on hand. If we have a major emergency and nobody shows up, we're going to be a little annoyed. But there are lots of other things we're asking police to do more and more that are really not in their job description. And those things need to be put out to the people that are in their job description.
Yeah, case workers, social workers.
Exactly.
A lot of other things. School monitor, a lot of things we actually law enforcement.
And then it's all the budget constraints of fighting. And I don't know if you ever watched the legislature go through the budgeting process, but it is not fun because there's so many different competing interests.
Yeah. And that's the case. There's so many competing interests competing for funding for this, and a lot of strange things start to take place.
I'll give you some statistics from just, the public defender system is actually in this state quite well funded compared to other states. But we had a study done about 1.5 years, 2 years ago by the National Center for State Courts, and which is certainly not pro-defense in any way, stretch of short form, but they were doing a workflow study to determine whether we were adequately staffed. And just my office alone, we are 73% understaffed. They're telling us we need 13 more lawyers to handle the level we had then. And with the pandemic now, I think my lawyers are carrying 200% of their caseload. They're going to need to have something addressed when we actually start processing cases again. Right now, because we're not moving much in court, we can tread water with cases because they're not being actually dealt with for the most part. They're just continued.
We're probably getting ready to start moving cases again.
And when we start doing that, we're going to have, as we keep describing it, a tsunami coming in on us.
Truly a tsunami.
But it's not just us. The prosecution suffers the same thing. Police officers, nobody stopped committing crimes during the pandemic.
They didn't.
May have gotten a little less on the school stuff because nobody was in school.
Exactly. But everything else kept right on rolling.
Yeah, and so those cases have all piled up, and they have to be dealt with. And we have limited judicial resources, prosecutorial resources, and defense counsel resources. There are not even enough attorneys who accept court-appointed cases from our overflow or conflict in the county to take all the ones we currently have, even if we farmed them all out.
Yeah.
So they need to do some things with that. I have put in a request to the county to see if they can use some of the money that has been authorized by Congress to fund temporary positions for like a year or two to get these things back to the normal level, at least back to where we were, 13 under. So
I got a question for you. So you've seen a lot of things in your 30 plus years. And, there's this conversation that happens out there. And I guess Richard Pryor said it one time in conversation on one of his jokes that when you go down to the courthouse, all you see is us, right? Looking for just us, right? But he was saying justice. So if you think about in all the years you have been practicing, would you say that justice is justice or justice is fair?
It frankly depends on the individual case, the individual lawyers and prosecutors involved. There are clearly people, and no offense to Senator Scott, but he's wrong. There are racists in this country, and there is a racism streak in this country.
Without question.
Yeah, it's not, I don't think it's pervasive about the majority of people in this country, but there's certainly there, and it needs to be acknowledged. And
I appreciate you acknowledging that.
People have they make sort of a crass or cynical joke about we have an offense that we call driving while black because you got pulled over. Why? Well, if you look at the percentages of people who are pulled over, it is much higher for minorities, Hispanics and blacks than it is for whites. And it may be as a result that there's more crime in certain neighborhoods, so there's more police presence in certain neighborhoods, so they see more things that happen there, and it raises. But the statistics are still there.
Numbers are numbers.
But individually, I think each person is judged. And all of the judges that I deal with try to be fair. I mean, all of us have an inherent bias one way or the other on certain things, but most people try to make sure that they stay on the straight and narrow about judging what's in front of them and going through. But they still need to determine, someone who comes from an affluent family, whether they're white, black, or Hispanic, is going to be better resourced in trying to recover from a criminal conviction than someone who has no money, whether they are black, white, or...
How about going into the system, right? Mm-hmm. Let's say this...
You're talking about bail.
No, I'm talking about for example, this guy, suspect one is charged with same thing. They charge both for the same crime. Suspect one is very affluent. He has a lot of resources. This guy over here has to have a public defender. They're both going into the same charge. Who has a better chance of surviving going in? Now, we know who has a better chance of surviving coming out because they got the resources. Just come on back. Mom and dad going to take care of you.
Oddly enough, it depends on the level of charge and the level of defender you have.
Okay.
Because most, except for the very wealthiest people who can afford private counsel, their resources are going to be strained to get things like expert witnesses or other outside testing that they have to fund themselves. Whereas if, for example, my office is representing them, we have the ability to hire experts. We can independently test things. We can get them paid for by the state upfront, and so the client doesn't have to cover that. Ultimately, if they are convicted or plead guilty, that might be part of the cost they're expected to pay back, but they don't have to foot that bill up front. And we can hire fully qualified experts, fully qualified testing groups, anything that we need to defend the case. And for example, when I have a murder case, as I gear up, I have 18 people I can use to assist me. So I can pick two or three of them if I want to and say, here, we're working on this case. So we have a lot of time to do that. Not that it isn't cutting into other cases, but they're not on the cusp of going to trial. So we have to allocate manpower where it should be going. Whereas a private firm, you hire the best private counsel in the world. If they're by themselves, they're going to have difficulty just managing those resources. Now, some of our better lawyers do that without question, and there's no question. And the concern that most people seem to have is that, well, I've hired a private lawyer, and he must have it better in with the judge, which hopefully is not true. I think all of our judges are quite honorable and have the integrity to say they might talk with the lawyer when they're not going to talk on an ex parte basis, meaning, just them and the lawyer about a case where other parties are represented. And we do have elections in this state where their judges are funded by people making donations, but then again, I make donations to judges too. And I don't think they take that into account in their individual decision making. They may take that into account when they're talking to you over cocktails, but that's about it. I don't think that most people would have a benefit of who you know. It's just a matter of your resources and what you can apply. And also, quite frankly, the evidence you got in your case. There are some cases where, I have the worst defendant on the planet, but I look at this case and go, well, the state can't prove elements 1, 2, and 3. They are SOL. On the other hand, I could have, St. Peter himself, who's unfortunately had a slight aberration in his character, and they got him on video. So that's going without too much trouble. So it just depends on the evidence that's there for the most part, and the amount of effort the state wants to expend resources on, which will depend on the level of crime and the level of victim impact.
So I got a question for you. So you've seen a lot again. What do you see we can do better in the criminal justice system? What are some of the things that we can do to ensure that justice is really justice? How can we ensure that, because there is a population of Black and brown and poverty people that feel like when I go down there to the courthouse, I'm not going to get justice. I'm not going to be treated fair. I'm going to be handled differently.
Well, and that is a perception, and unfortunately perception can be people's reality.
Exactly.
And it may not be true in a lot of those cases, but it's still their perception.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's been made from how they've been dealt with in other areas of their life.
Right.
From the time, whether they're followed around in the store because they're shopping and so, oh, you look like you might be a shoplifter. Whereas some, rich white lady or well-dressed white lady wandering around doesn't get a second glance. And that's just not the way it should be. But unfortunately, it is. And so that carries over into the perception of, well, that's going to be the same way I'm treated at the courthouse. We need more people. Every time I make a hire, for example, I evaluate whether I can hire someone who is equally qualified, and if the diversity factor comes in play, if they're equally qualified, I'm going for the diversity factor. If they're not equally qualified, I have to take the better qualified candidate. But it would have to be significantly different. I mean, if they're pretty much equal in there, then I'm going to look for someone who I can, because our office needs to reflect the people we're representing. They're more comfortable that way.
True.
But don't get me wrong, we represent a lot of white folk too. So, but that's the pool of resources that's available there needs to be made as diverse as we can and still maintaining the competency that's expected in the office. There is a problem in that because the same reason that we were talking about societal inequities, basically monetary, et cetera, is the lack of opportunity. And so there aren't as many Hispanic or Black lawyers as there are white lawyers, simply because schooling hasn't been available. Hopefully that's getting better. And I think in recent pools, I have seen more of that with better qualified candidates who are more racially diverse. But that's going to take a while. But yeah, there is a problem with that. And part of that is having this justice system reflect the people that are dealing with. But in this county, we have a fair number of Black judges and Hispanic. I don't think we have any Hispanic anymore, but Judge Bedsworth was our closest, and he's retired. But we also have prosecutors who are racially diverse, defense lawyers who are racially diverse, bailiffs and other court personnel who are racially diverse. So I think we're getting towards a better mix. We're certainly not where we should be.
That's good. So you and I were talking right before we started filming. We were talking about a situation out in Elizabeth City about transparency. What do you think about that? You say we need to change the law.
Well, I was appalled, and we were lobbying against that law when it was first adopted because it makes it look like we're hiding stuff, especially in high-profile cases where everybody wants to know what happened, and the video is the best evidence. The way the law is structured right now, the police are not authorized to release that video unless a Superior Court judge lets them, and you have to file an action to get it if you're a newspaper or an individual or otherwise. It even limits some of the defense counsel ability to get it. We have to get it through the DA, and in district court, there's no discovery for that. Most of them are quite good about giving it if needed, but it's still protected. So it would have to be produced through some sort of court order showing that that's what's needed even for a case. But when that law came in, it was specifically designed to prevent it from getting out to the papers and inflaming the situation. But in reality, what it's doing is inflaming the situation when we don't release it because
we don't have the information.
Yeah, if we're straight up and say, look, well, it looks bad, but here's the video, but here's another video that's got a different angle. So it's not as bad as this one makes it look. But if we don't give them anything, then it looks like we're hiding something. And I was watching on a national news program the other day where a legal commentator who should know better and probably read the law before he came in basically accused the sheriff down there of deliberately hiding it because he had the authority to release it and he was choosing not to, which was absolutely wrong.
True.
He had no authority to release
None.
that. And he had to come out and say, I'm asking the court to release it. And I don't know why the judge hearing it, I know Judge Foster, I think he's the one who heard it. And Judge Foster's a quite reasonable judge, so I don't know why he kept it sealed, and someone may have convinced them that it would damage an investigation or otherwise. But I would hope, and I know there is some movement in the legislature to try to address that, it would seem to me that the better approach to that, to give transparency, that sort of situation, would be allowing a period of 48 to 72 hours when it's not subject to release, and giving a law enforcement agency or prosecutor time to petition the court to say, no, we can't let this out for this reason, and here, it's a valid reason, and here's why it needs to be kept. But barring that, when that time period is over, then it becomes a public record, and let them have it. Because without it, there's an argument from the other side that, well, you might pollute the jury pool because they might see evidence ahead of time. Well, if it's a video, it's probably going to come in anyway, because it's very unlikely that they could just say, well, that's a totally fake, video. We can't use it. It's going to be authenticated and say, well, here's what it shows. And most people, surprisingly enough, I have several high-profile cases right now that the publicity has been extreme, but I'm not sure the jury pool, when it comes in, most of them will have still seen it. It's, 9 different above-the-fold articles in the Winston-Salem Journal may get the journal's subscription base, but a lot of people don't read the journal. And they may have it on WXII a couple times, but unless you saw that 30-second clip on WXII, you didn't see it.
True.
So it'd be surprised how many people come into jury pools going, honestly, I haven't heard anything about it.
Wow. Well, I want you to know you have truly lived up to your reputation. I'll never forget. I knew of you, and I was talking to a lawyer. I want to say Granger, that's his name. And I was saying, what's he like? He said he's brilliant. He's a walking dictionary, black law dictionary.
I have no social life and spend the time reading the law.
Yeah. So he was truly accurate in his statement about you. And it has been a pleasure having you on Off the Cuffs with us today. You have truly lived up to your reputation. And thank you for all that you do, helping the underdog, fighting for those that need the defense. Anytime you want to stop by here, please do. And thank you for being with us on Off the Cuff.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here. So.
Thank you.